The Honourable Chief Justice, honourable members of the Judiciary, invited guests, members of the legal profession, ladies and gentlemen, and also our panelists who joined us. Thank you very much for your attendance this year at the conference, the 23rd conference. We're also very lucky to get His Excellency, our President, to do the opening. He has a very busy schedule. In fact, the day he opened the conference, he had to rush back to Suba as he had other engagements, so we really appreciate that. Traditionally, at the end of the conference, I tend to summarize some of the key issues. Somebody said to me yesterday, I think, they said that one of the lawyers was remarking and said, the AG's conference nowadays don't really talk about legal issues. They don't necessarily talk about, rule number 52 or 60, or about, for example, judicial review. A lot of these fundamental issues are expected for you to have those skill sets in any case. Of course, there needs to be brushing up of those skill sets. But what we have done, if you would have noticed in the subject matters that we do discuss in the topics, is that they're more about legal areas, perhaps that have never been traversed before, or areas that are now emanating because of the fact that digital age has come in, because society is changing, because demographics is changing, or because international law has in fact been implemented offshore and which we need to implement ourselves. So the idea is to provide an opportunity for you to be able to not just, for example, become aware of many issues that you may not necessarily be aware of, but also contribute to those learnings. These are the type of public consultations that we do have. And in fact, if you look at some of the topics, even the last one, some of the comments that have been made are fairly inane if you actually looked at the subject matter itself. So for example, we all know the THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, is relating to the chemical composition of that particular plant that has what you call psychotropic effects on you, which means simply that's what gets you high. So if the THC level is going to be high, then obviously you'll go higher. If the THC level is not high, you won't get high. As you saw in the presentation by those experts from the agriculture sector, in particular from Australia, they talked about the different states in Australia that allowed different THC levels. So now, for example, the last gentleman from Australia, he spoke about now Victoria will go up to 1%. So in other words, if it's a THC level of up to 1%, it's legal to grow it. I saw Iqbal Khan outside, he's a criminal lawyer. So if, for example, when this bill gets put into effect, and you may have a farmer who may be growing or may be licensed, as you know that these things need to be licensed, and this is why I was particularly interested for you to learn about that, and hopefully you focused on that. Because these are the parameters of the license that he was talking about. So you may get somebody coming along to you and say, look, can you make this application for me? Can you apply for this license for me? You need to be aware of how the licensing regime will work. This is a preview as to what it could be. And obviously we don't want to reinvent the wheel. If Australia has done it well, we'd like to actually borrow it from Australia and tweak it slightly. Or if somebody's been given a license to grow, hemp at THC levels that's up to 1% only, but in between he may be planting plants that may be more than THC levels. So if you're a criminal lawyer, how do you deal with it? So these are sort of, some of the, some people may call it semantics, but these are sort of kind of finer points of the law that we wanted you to be able to understand. And one of the reasons why we have for the past decade or so brought about these topics to this particular forum, because all of you really are opinion shapers in your own right. You have a sphere of influence, whether it's in a law firm, whether it's in a community work, or whether the town you work in, or the particular statutory organization you work in, and you actually shape and help public opinion. And that in itself is consultation. Consultation is not only about parliamentary members going off and trotting across and getting consultations. public consultation actually are done in many different ways. And that's the reason why we bring up these topics. So I wanted to just sort of put that as a preface because, and I think a lot of people need to understand why we actually bring this about. It's also for you to be able to, and I've been saying this for the past number of years, unfortunately the legal profession in Fiji, in particular those who are in the private profession, tend not to specialize. And there is a lack of specialization. You know, I can tell you law firms that have a very good website, and a lot of you who are in private practice don't, with very good websites, market themselves, for example, as trademark registration specialists, charge $10,000 to $15,000 for each registration. For some foreign company who's got a big brand, wants to register the trademark in Fiji. And guess what the registration fee of trademark is? $5.40, I think. So they put an ad in the paper, they pay the $5.40, $10,000 later, $5,000 later, $15,000 later, thank you very much. Most lawyers in Fiji are general practitioners. There is now enough spheres of law being developed in Fiji where people can actually specialize. You may say, well, hang on, maybe I won't just specialize in one area. Okay, you can do maybe 2 or 3. But develop that expertise. What it would appear to me that all the lawyers in private practice, well, most of them, not all of them, seem to be fighting for the same crumbs. And you're missing out on the cream. And I've said this repeatedly, and I hope people do take it up, because there's an opportunity in specialization. I can bet you, if I asked all of you, we discussed this last year, how many of you have read the Climate Change Act? Nobody. If you read the Climate Change Act, there's actually, purely from a commercial perspective, there's an opportunity for you to make money from it. There's now going to be trading of carbon. It's got proprietary rights. People talk about conveyancing, we talked about leases, tenants' rights, etc. But there's also proprietary rights in carbon trading. How many of you pre-positioned yourself in that space? There's so many opportunities. But people are simply not doing, we're sticking to what they call the traditional areas of law. But we're becoming a sophisticated society. We're becoming a society that's, for example, a digital age. The FDB now is disbursing loans through M-Pesa and MyCash up to $5,000. They just started a couple of weeks ago. The applications for those loans are now done online, and they disburse funds through M-Pesa and MyCash, a loan. So, you see, and there's various ramifications as a result of that. The loans are not disbursed on time. If payments are not done on time, who's going to be culpable? Who holds the liability in that respect? I mean, have you thought about these things? And what rights emanate from that? And indeed, if there's breaches, it's not just only about constitutional rights. There could be other rights that could be breached. So, I mean, this is the reason why we raise these issues, for you to be able to think about these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, just on the national payment system, I mean, one of the things that we set out from a policy perspective, obviously, was to try and demystify the finance space. There's still so many people who don't have bank accounts until recently. There's a lot of projects about it. I mean, I remember as a kid, they used to bring the banks, Bank of New South Wales, some of you don't know, it's Westpac, Bank of New South Wales used to come and they have this savings book. They try and encourage you to save. Many people have not gone through that experience, but many Fijians don't bank. Now, what's happened as a result of money wallets now, many people now actually are banking through money wallets. It's a competition for the banks too. But banks have a different business model. Mobile money wallets are a different business model. So, you see, all of these things are emanating. And as I highlighted yesterday, that in the first round of the 360 that we disbursed over $100 million, we could have disbursed it in one day, $105 million, but we didn't. We took 1 week to disperse it. But there was a group of people who actually did apply. They filled out the form, but it never reached us. Now, thankfully, we managed to resolve that matter. But assuming if it was not resolved, is it the mobile phone company's issue? Is it our issue? Who's going to be held culpable for that? In terms of, for example, payment gateways now, of course, you can pay LTA fine through mobile money wallet. This is significantly changed. Rights, obligations actually get affected. But I think the point about somebody raised the issue of privacy. They're saying, well, now, for example, when you apply for 360, you have to give your TIN number, you have to give your BRN number, your address. These are very basic information that you would fill out in any case when you go and apply physically. You'd have to give that. The upside of it, of course, now is that every single person that's applied for 360, in fact, has a tax identification number. So next time when we want to assist somebody, we know exactly who we are assisting. We know exactly how many people, for example, we have a breakdown of gender. We know how many women in the Nasinu area who did small business have received 360. Some of them gave additional information. Say, I do pineapple selling, or I sell boiled EV, or I do fish and cassava. But now I can't do it because I have to supply to the garment factory in Nandawa. Garment factory shut down. So I don't no longer have a business, so I need the 360. That's good data. And how is that data used is the issue that I raised. Privacy in its own self does not mean you don't give data or don't give information. Privacy means is that whether you consent to give the information and whoever you give that information to, whether they have the ability to pass that information to somebody else. As I mentioned the other day, so many of you have given all the information to your mobile phone companies. And they're using that information, some without your consent even. I know your birthdays without your consent. That's what happens. So when we as lawyers talk about these issues about privacy, you've got to contextualize, you've got to understand exactly what you're talking about when you talk about privacy. Giving of information through your own consent is not a breach of privacy. Breach of privacy is when somebody accesses your information without you consenting to it. The fundamental basis, and I'm afraid a lot of lawyers, unfortunately, and a lot of people in the mainstream are actually getting many of these issues actually confused. Perhaps politicizing, I'm not sure, but maybe just very naively are confusing these areas. They say now that the digital transaction is becoming ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's happening at the same time. The same way with telecommunications. The internet is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. How do you access that? From a policy perspective, of course, and some of you may want to raise this, and I'm sure many people could, those who want to use constitutional redress. They say digital space is now becoming a basic right. So, talking about connecting the unconnected. So a child who's in the interior of Lakandrove who does not have internet connection, access to internet. If we tomorrow rolled out the school curriculum for year 4 through the internet, everybody in Suva, Lotoka, Nandi, all the kids, all the parents have access to that. And they have the syllabus. But if that kid does not have access to internet connectivity, isn't that a breach of his or her constitutional right to education? Of course it would be. If the system is going to be dependent on the digital rollout. Lawyers need to look at these things. So this is why when I was talking about the digital connectivity, we need to look at it holistically. There's about, I think about 42 different sites that we're connecting in Vanuatu. Now there's no point giving them connectivity if they don't have access to electricity. There's no point giving them connectivity if they don't have the ability or the means to buy a phone or buy a PC or buy a laptop. So you take a holistic approach to these things. And this is why when you're also making laws, because laws are now becoming a lot more broadened, because we have socio-economic rights now. Before we didn't have to worry about it. Lawyers only could worry about civil and political rights. Now it's civil, political, and socio-economic rights. And again, I lament the fact that there is a very little number of matters being referred to the courts in the socio-economic space. I think the other point that I also wanted to highlight is in digital space very quickly before I finish off is that, it also ties in things like our obligations, international obligations like terrorism financing, like money laundering. You'd be surprised how many countries they've used the digital space to launder ill-gotten gains from prostitution, child pornography, drugs. So the national payment system is about not liability of RBF, but how RBF can rein in all these possible breaches in respect of our own laws. That's really important for us to be aware of. We, of course, now, for example, there's a case, and I thought some lawyer would bring it up. I recently heard last year, a person turned up to CWM hospital. It was about 9 p.m., wanting to get their family member admitted in the paying ward. They said, for us to be able to admit your family member, you have to pay us $450 up front. We need it now. That's the policy of the hospital. So they said, but I have to go down to the bank. Now, assuming if I add a bit of spice to it, what if it's curfew time? They don't have a car, they've turned up in a taxi. Now there's no taxi available. They can't go to the nearest ATM. They can't get the family member admitted to the hospital. What kind of breaches pertaining to their rights are taking place here? What is the government's obligation? These are very fundamental issues. Nobody's touching on this. We have now, in this budget, as Honorable Tambuya would tell you, that Parliament approved X number of $1 million or so in terms of rolling out FPOS machines in all government ministries. So hospitals now have FPOS machines. So you can do a payment from there. We're going to other areas. We provided now, for example, in the budget, we made allocation that, the shops that have M-Pesa, the QR code, they actually have to pay a monthly fee. So we are now paying their monthly fee so people can have access to MQR codes. They don't have to travel, 5 kilometers to go and buy the loaf of bread or whatever it is. They can actually buy it from nearest store. They've got their money wallet and they simply just cash it. They don't have to go to the shop 5 kilometers to bring the actual cash. These are actually very pertinent issues pertaining to rights too. I just wanted to make one comment regarding this, and I put it in my notes here, is that the accountants recently had a change in the entire regime that governs accountants, quite significantly. So a lot of accountants now actually can set up their own practices. And we envisage also that they will also commence advertising in the regulations. And I've said this on the floor the other day, lawyers need to start looking at that. You can advertise through approval from the chief registrar. I don't think he's received any applications. I don't think so. Have you? Only a few. And I hope it has not been rejected. But the fact of the matter is that you can do so, and you should do so. The last point that I wanted to make in that area also, I'm quite happy to sort of talk about a lot further, is the ensuring that the interoperability issues are critically important, as I think it was the Vodafone rep talked about. At the moment, for example, your e-ticketing card can only pay for your bus fare. That card, if you go to places like Hong Kong, you can use it at Optus, I think it's called, or Opus. You can use it on a train, on the bus, you can buy food with it, etc. So we are disbursing funds, for example, through social welfare. We're going to do it through these cards. And again, it's sort of going to socio-economic rights. Fiduciary duty, of course, is very important. I think I don't need to necessarily highlight that, but it is in fact a very important matter. What is particularly interesting for us is that I know a lot of you lawyers are here from statutory organizations. You're not working for private law firms where you get private clients coming in. So how do you, in your statutory organization, how do you fulfill that fiduciary duty to your clients? I mean, I had a comment made to me once from the Solicitor General's office. There may be a case, for example, in the PS for agriculture, there's some matter pertaining to agriculture. They said, oh, I don't need to talk to them, they're not lawyers. But that's where the complaint came from. Ministry of Agriculture was being taken to court. So they are your clients. What is the SOP in the SG's office pertaining to your duty as a lawyer to your client? And similarly, if you have that attitude even in the private practice, a lot of people may come to you, but they may know nothing about the law. It does not mean you start dictating to them as to what they should do as a strategy. You need to put all the options to them. You need to say, if you settle, this is what it will mean. If you don't settle, this is what it will mean. If you don't settle, we go to trial, this is how much it's going to cost you. We had a case, matter some years back now, not probably about 5 years ago, where a young boy in one of the district hospitals in Fiji went to the hospital, only child, father was very worried, in kindergarten, and they gave him Panadol and said, go home. He had a headache. Father was not satisfied, his headache continued, went back again. So that doctor, the next shift, decided, we need to give him a drip. Gave him a drip. The next doctor came in the next shift, gave him another drip. The third doctor came, gave him another drip. So it's 2.5 drips. Now this boy is bloating. So that third doctor suddenly panicked because the father is saying, look, my child is actually bloating now. He said, oh, we have to drain the fluid out of him, we have to put a catheter up him. Unfortunately, they could not find a catheter for a child. So they put an adult catheter in him. And the boy started bleeding. And the father then wanted to take him from that hospital to the bigger hospital in the next town. He said, no, you have to wait for the hospital. He said, no, I want to take him in the taxi. And amidst all of this, the boy died. It only happened a few years ago. Now, this matter was brought to our attention. We immediately then made some inquiries. One doctor, I think, left the country. One doctor went to the other hospital, and this barrier came up. So, we are culpable. So we settled. We referred them to legal aid. The terms of settlement was drawn up. And I still remember the day. It's actually very unsettling when I talk about it now. I still remember the day when the parents came in and the check was put in front of them, they just pushed it aside. And all they wanted to do was to show us the photograph of their son. So these things do happen. Whether a lawyer needed to jump in, I don't know. But what I'm saying is that this is why I continuously talk about jurisprudence. If these kind of cases are brought up, then it will make those people who provide these services sit up. You have to do that. And it goes to the point what Davnesh was saying about your ability to tell your client that, look, don't pursue this case, settle this case, because your chances of winning is not good. Not just a question about winning, or you're in very weak legal ground. We could have decided and said, no, let them take us to court. These are low-income people, let's see how much they get. We could have done that. Legally, we have the right to do that. Is it morally and ethically the right thing to do? Of course not. And to top it off, one of the public officials said to the parents when they went to see them, this is before they came to us, they said, you're a young couple, you can have another child. You see, so the level of sensitivity needs to be there too. And as lawyers, as judges, we need to understand that. So, I think fiduciary duty for those of you who work, whether it's Solicitor General's Office or AG's Chambers, or whether it's in LTA, or whether you work for AMSEF, whatever the matter issue is, you have to be able to have that level of fiduciary duty. And I completely agree with also what Davnesh said in respect of your duty to the court, because you are officers of the court. I've seen so many times, even in recent submissions that I've read from lawyers, where they are not sticking to the point of law, where you can see they're obfuscating, obscurantism, big time obscurantism, just to simply have one over the other. And your ability to acknowledge a point raised by the other side is critically important. You know, I don't know how many of you here who are here today were here for Dr. James Fong's after-dinner speech. He made a very pertinent issue about your ability to have humility to be able to do that. Otherwise your ego will drive everything. And it's critically important. In respect of landlords and tenants, I think there's a number of cases, obviously. The Director of Legal Aid talked about one of those cases, but there's also, I think there's a case by the Human Rights Commission, by the Proceedings Commissioner, where they had a case on behalf of Usania Manakiwai, who was also a tenant. I think damages of about $25,000 was ordered by the court. I don't know whether it was appealed or not, but there was damages ordered up to that point. And I think, you know, it's a very interesting area now, because as also the director highlighted, there are also landlords whose rights are being breached. We also know, and I've referred matters to the CO, FCCC, about where landlords actually calling up, we have recalcitrant tenants. What are their rights and obligations? One of the reasons why we wanted you to participate in this, because that's another area of the law we are looking at revamping. Because we need to have standardized tenants agreements. And currently, at the moment, of course, there's a lot more consultations. We are erring on the side of having a separate tribunal where disputes, even before that actually, where you have standardized tenancy agreements. I'm talking about residential tenancy agreements in respect of what are the rights and obligations of the landlords and the tenants that needs to be specifically stated. We still have today in Fiji dispute about the tenant not wanting to pay the rent because the tap did not work for 3 hours, and he's saying, no, 3 hours is not bad. Those kind of matters need to be simplified, because it leads to litigation, it leads to dispute, it leads to instability, social instability. And people are not happy about things, happy about very fundamental things that should be actually taken for granted. So it's lawyers, it's legal practitioners, it's our responsibility to make things a lot more easier. I mean, the case in point is that, as I highlighted yesterday, third-party insurance. Third-party insurance, many lawyers thrived on third-party insurance. Claims were delayed, working class people, some person getting off the bus, kid runs off behind the bus, gets hit by the car. For you to get compensated, you have to show that the driver was at fault. Dragged on, adjournment sought, large insurance companies, people could not fight it. Lawyers would say, we'll take 50% of whatever you get, some even more. That's all gone now. We now have ACCF. People get paid within, I mean, money is not the only thing, but of course the compensation is significant for some people, in particular if there's a breadwinner, or even an acknowledgement of the wrong that has been committed. Many lawyers decried the fact, oh, you know, our practices will go out of practice. No, you won't. In the same way, many lawyers decried when we brought about these IP laws, trademarks, patents, designs. Some of them making a killing on it. Some of them don't even want the Madrid system. Other was talking about one issue. The Madrid system is about if you register here and you're part of the Madrid system, your trademark gets registered throughout those who are involved in the Madrid system. It's so easy. Similarly, if they register there, it gets registered in ours. So, you see, these are the changes that are taking place in the law, and the lawyers need to understand this. Ramesh Patel talked about essentially focus on tenancy regarding land. And there's obviously the standard practices that are there. But one issue that I think has not been addressed, which is a big issue in Fiji, and I don't know how many of you have litigated on that, is on Vakavanua arrangements. There are a lot of people in Fiji who don't have proper leases. They live on Vakavanua arrangements. Some of them have lived there for the past 2 years, some have lived there for the past 30 years. So what happens to those tenants who are living on Vakavanua arrangements? Some of them are paying $30 a month, some are paying $50 a month. Sometimes there's a need, they'll ask them for more. There's a wedding or whatever it is. What happens to their rights? And if you look at it, it has a whole systemic issue, because you won't get funding from a bank if you live on a Vakavanua arrangement. You won't get FNPF, access to FNPF funds to build your homes, but you will get FNPF access to build your home, 50%, if you have a proper lease, if you have freehold, or if you belong to a land-owning unit in which you're a member of and you're building on your communally held land, because you know nobody can boot you out, that's your land. So FNPF will allow you to take out your funds to build your home. So that's one area of the law that has not been actually dealt with. I do not necessarily have the answer, but those of you who actually answer right now, but those of you who actually are dealing this area, you need to be able to, think about these. What do we do? Of course, from a government perspective, we're trying to encourage landowners to subdivide their lands. We're actually paying for the subdivision of the land so they can issue proper leases. And in that way, they have security. Some of them actually will become millionaires overnight. We have one lady whose land we've developed in Samani. We're just about to finish it. In fact, we decided to climate-proof her subdivision. The original plan was to have the cables on top. Now it's being put underground. She'll easily sell those lots for at least 120, 150,000 minimum. 30 lots, not bad. All the money goes to her. But the tenants get a 99-year lease. So people can go and use that land to the bank, with the bank, use it as collateral and build proper homes, which creates, of course, industry. The other point I want, and I hope many of you looked at what the New South Wales is doing, because we intend to look at the New South Wales model very closely. Mapping traditional knowledge, the Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expression Bill, commonly known as TKCE. It's a very interesting area, as some of the issues that were highlighted. And as I wanted to make the point, and one of the reasons we did discuss this, because from my discussion with a number of lawyers and other people, even prior to the conference, a lot of people were confusing it with trademarks and patents and designs. The conventions we've ratified, the bills have been approved by Parliament. We are currently working with WIPO in respect of operationalizing. We need to put a number of regulations. We need to build capacity with the Fiji Intellectual Property Office. It's a very exciting area. And I don't know how many of you actually know about it or have looked at it. You should. You really should. That's one area. But the Traditional Knowledge and Cultural Expression Bill is opening up another world. And as the speakers demonstrated, you don't necessarily actually have, it's not necessarily clear-cut. The cultural mapping exercise is critically important. And one of the things that we are looking at, I think Ada, you raised this issue, is that perhaps once the library is done, we need to have another round of allowing people to come and look at the library. Whether people may want to dispute what's in the library in terms of assignment of, whether this particular style of making the iri is from that particular area or not. It could be a cross-section of two districts. We don't know that. Some of them are clear-cut, some of them are not. So perhaps once the library is done, we could open it up. Somebody raised in the corner over there whether they're doing that with the Rotuman community. Very good point. And you see, if you look at the ambit of this particular area, it says about indigenous and local community. It's about traditional knowledge of indigenous and local community. So you could have a local community, somewhere in the middle of Nawai Zomba, right up in the hills, where you had 30 cane farmers who've been living there for the past 70 years. They may have developed some, traditional knowledge, some medicine that they concoct between turmeric and this and that. Nobody else has it. that really also should be registered, because that is an IP. So it's traditional knowledge of indigenous and local communities. So we need to be able to look at, like, for example, the issue of neem, but neem, of course, now has been much litigated, in fact, in the international sphere. And I think it is critically important that we open it up far more for discussions and indeed the input. One point is really important is that, which some people have kind of talked about, is registration. If you look at the Companies Act and also trademarks, we don't, as I highlighted, we don't, certain words which we think is, whether it's lingua franca or whether it's commonly used word, we believe it should not become the domain of a private interest. I think, Ada, you said you raised the word Bula in USA. But should he do that? Should Bula belong only to one company? Isn't Bula said by everybody in Fiji? We don't allow the word Bula to be registered in Fiji by any company. Because why should it be only for company XYZ? Bula is used by everybody. You come to this hotel, it's Bula. So it should not become the domain of one entity, because they are private interests. So in the same way, we don't allow anybody to register and own the name Vanua. We don't, because Vanua is a common word. It should not belong to only one company. So if we lament the fact that somebody has registered that word offshore, why are we doing it offshore? That's the question. In fact, we have talked about in Fiji how we want to go and test the market in USA. So, for example, the PS Agriculture mentioned about exports. We apparently now highly sought after as far as the turmeric market is concerned. Fijian ginger is very highly sought after. So one of the ways we are looking at whether, in terms of owning that property, is whether the state should actually register the trademark. So the Fijian government owns the word Fijian ginger or Fiji ginger or Fiji turmeric. Then those of you who want to export have the ability to get that name and put it on yourself, because we give them the license to use our trademark. That's one way of getting around it. So we want to see whether Fiji Water is going to challenge us. So there are ways that we can do that, where a common name that we want to use as our branding should be owned by the state, and the state can allow people who meet various standards or criteria to be able to then use that. That's the way to go. Otherwise, we're actually becoming hypocritical. We don't allow them to do it here, but we're going to do it over there. The other point that I also wanted to make was, I think somebody had raised the issue of, and this is how sort of fine-tuned it becomes, or nuanced it becomes, is, for example, you saw the livery of the Fiji Airways, the livery of the tail, some people call it. We have that particular motive. There was a lady, Makreta Matamosi, she was actually assigned to do that particular design. And so she did the design. And she then charged Fiji Airways money for that particular design. And then she did other designs, which Fiji Airways then went to the trademarks to register that. Then there were objections to that. And none of those trademarks were registered, except for this one. Subsequently, unfortunately, she passed away. Before she passed away, she wanted more money. So then she passed away, and then the family then settled the matter with Fiji Airways. They paid some other financial benefits from that. But the issue from that is this, and this is how fine-tuned it can become from an economic perspective. If, for example, a particular area has a particular design, right, that may belong to a particular, say, province or area or Vusa, then if somebody from that community makes a design that's not similar to it at all, but is different, but uses a style that could be similar, or uses, for example, or does it on Masi, for example, but it's completely different, the design. How do you determine? That's where you will actually get litigation. So the issue is, if you need to look at the rationale of it, why is this being done? One of them would be, of course, to ensure that it's protected, it's not exploited. But does it mean that those people who own it should not actually generate some income from it? And if they are going to generate some income from it, how is it going to be managed? That's critically important. And who will be the people who will decide how it's going to be managed? And then who will be the beneficiaries of it? So if some company comes along and says to you, we will pay you $1 million if we could use this particular traditional motif of yours on our product. So that payment needs to be made to somebody. So who is that payment going to be made to? You know, in Aboriginal culture, there are certain practices that only the women carry out. But more importantly, they don't tell anyone else. You go to certain parts of Arnhem Land, they go to certain areas. I think there's one place near what's called, Uluru or Ayers Rock. Only the women go there. The men from the tribe don't even know what they do. So they may not want to, for example, have that recorded. Because that's part of the culture of oral passing down of those practices. So you have to understand it's not necessarily always very easy, and we have to sort of navigate our way through this by everybody's input. And of course, with a lot of transparency in that respect. Industrial hemp, of course, just two stories just to contextualize it. I mean, most of you drink Coca-Cola. The word Coca-Cola, coca. Coca is what you get cocaine from. That's how they started making Coca-Cola. And there's a product called cola, which actually has caffeine product. It started off as, and I've got it written down here, it started off as a health tonic because it had a stimulant in it. Got you high, got you energy, maybe like an equivalent of V-drink, I don't know, or Red Bull. But that's how Coca-Cola started off from. At that time, the usage of coca was not illegal. In the same way in the presentation they highlighted, the usage of marijuana fiber for sailcloths was not illegal in Australia until 1937. So when we talk about the legality and illegality of this, you have to understand where this legality, the paradigm has come from. Who set it? Was it banned because the synthetic companies that discovered this new product wanted to market the product more, and they knew that, for example, hemp would be a front-runner competitor for them? Is that why they did it? You go to many parts of Southern Asia where they put bhang used in traditional ceremonies. Bhang is basically a mixture, I think, of milk and yogurt with marijuana. Up the Valley Road, I know people used to, when I was a young kid, after a hard day's work in the farm, they sit underneath the neem tree on the rope bed and smoke a pot. It was not seen as something, I'm doing something really, out there. Just seen part and parcel of the culture. So when people talk about it, many people actually talk that alcohol actually is a more addictive drug and causes a lot more social harm than perhaps some of these other, natural drugs. I'm not here, making a case for smoking pot. But what I'm saying is that when we talk about legality and illegality, we need to understand the historical basis for this. The current law is that it is illegal. So if we do want to get into, planting industrial hemp, and there's a point of distinction. We said industrial hemp, we did not say medicinal hemp. Because medicinal hemp requires you to have a higher level of THCs. We don't want to get into that space. So industrial hemp has very low levels of THC, and even then there's a licensing regime. We have made a budgetary allocation in this year's budget, a meager $30,000 for consultations on the legalizing or decriminalizing, I should say, the planting of industrial hemp. So those consultations will be done, Honorable Tambuya, throughout Fiji. That's already started. And like I said, it's not only the domain of the parliamentary committee, but in fact, in these types of forums, and when you go down at the particular level, we're engaging already with, as you saw, United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC is very important to do that. Tasmania and Australia plants opium. under license. The UN has UNODC, they plant opium because some of the drugs you use actually has a little bit of opium in it. You may not know this, it's got opium. So these things are happening, and if you see what is really interesting, and I find this kind of historical context basis very interesting, a lot of the colonized countries had these laws imposed upon them where they made it illegal. But the decriminalization is taking place in the ones that they actually decriminalized it in the first place. That's the irony of it. That's the irony of it. And we are the ones now holding on to say, let's not decriminalize it. But we can do so in a systematic manner. From an economic perspective, of course, I remember when I was the DPP's office, and I think Ada also mentioned this about, will we go back in time? Obviously, we're not going to go back in time. People have served their sentences. It's not about getting high. It's about industrial hemp for industrial purposes. But I remember there was, and after the 1987 coup, irrespective of the amount that you possessed on yourself, you served a mandatory sentence of 3 months. And if you look at the breakdown of those people who in fact were charged and convicted, they were between the ages of 17 to 23, 24. I remember the DPPs of that time, we looked at the statistics, and they came from all low-income families. So these are the guys who probably had no home, or they were living, 10 people living in a home. They had their first joint underneath the coconut tree behind the toilet, as opposed to the rich kids who probably drove in their car or had their own bedroom where they could smoke it. That was the reality. And a lot of them were doing their studies, 4th year, 3rd year, doing engineering, mechanics, whatever. And they went in for 3 months, and many of them, their lives changed completely. Some were raped, of course. So these were the things that actually happened. We can't roll back the time. But the fact of the matter is that that was the law then, and this is what we're looking at now. So the law, the lesson being the law needs to evolve. And the law needs to be just, of course, at the same time. The other sort of issue that lastly that I wanted to raise was that just again for the criminal lawyers, you need to understand the ambit of the law when this law is introduced. What are the rights and obligations of those people who get licenses, those who will be caught out, who won't be caught out. We need to also very heavily engage in the private sector. There's no point planting these things and nobody's going to manufacture them. So the private sector needs to actually make those investments. And what do we do in terms of the incentivizing of that? What type of private sector plays do we want in this space? Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for your participation in this conference. As we say, the numbers keep on growing. Unfortunately, there are some people we had to say no to because the numbers simply grew. Of course, there are certain COVID-safe protocols that we had to put in place and indeed adhere to. Otherwise, Dr. James Fong would have shut us down. Once again, I'd like to thank him. I'd like to thank all the panelists who participated, those of you who contributed. Please, I say this to you again, look at how you can actually develop specialization, how you can become experts in different areas, because there's a lot of opportunities that are out there. And please also adopt technology. It's critically important to adopt technology.